Donald Trump continues to push for National Guard on the ground in several U.S. cities, saying cities like Portland, Oregon are war-ravaged. It's a theme the president has been underlying since his last election campaign. But what's the wider picture of what this could mean? Here are some clips from one speech alone as the president spoke to America's top military brass last week.
We're under invasion from within. Washington, D.C. was the most unsafe, most dangerous city in the United States of America. And to a large extent, beyond. And beyond that, you go to Afghanistan, they didn't have anything like that. It's a war from within. Portland, Oregon, where it looks like a war zone. And I get a call from the liberal governor, "Sir, please don't come in. We don't need you." I said, well, unless they're playing false tapes, this looked like World War II. It's the enemy from within.
The president repeatedly claiming there's a war on the streets, while many local politicians are pushing back.
The number of necessary troops is 0. The president will not find lawlessness or violence here.
At the same time, the White House now says it's in a war with drug cartels. Videos released by Trump's office show the U.S. military targeting suspected drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean Sea. The White House is now calling those killed in the attacks, quote, unlawful combatants. This, as the American president calls it, the golden age of America right now. But is he also looking toward 2028? Professor Geoffrey Corn is director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech and a retired JAG lawyer who was the U.S. Army's senior advisor for law of war issues. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's start with what the White House sees as a war on drug cartels. President Trump has seemingly unilaterally decided that the U.S. is in an actual war with the cartels. Tell me, what constitutes being engaged in a war or armed conflict?
Well, under international law, which is widely regarded as controlling, there has to be a situation of hostilities between the state and an organized armed group. And when you cross that threshold, then you would have a situation of armed conflict. The president's notice to Congress was that he considers the United States to now be engaged in an armed conflict. Whether it's a war in a pragmatic sense is an understandable term, but for international law purposes and really domestic law purposes, the key finding was that phrase armed conflict, because that finding is the administration signaling or notifying Congress that it considers the use of wartime military power to now be legally justified.
So that use of the word war, that designation, it allows the president to do, I'm assuming, a raft of things that he otherwise wouldn't be able to do.
The way to think about it is pretty simple. Normally, the state's authority to use measures to address a threat to its people or society is framed by law enforcement principles, or at the international level, we would say human rights principles. And the most fundamental principle are very restrictive rules related to the use of force. As most people know, police officers are permitted to use deadly force, but only in response to an actual or imminent threat of unlawful violence that threatens life or great bodily harm. Once you cross that threshold into armed conflict, you trigger extraordinary government powers for the military. The power to use deadly force as a measure of first resort. The power to use deadly force not based on an indication of actual threat, but based on a determination that the individual qualifies as an enemy belligerent. The power to detain people that you capture indefinitely without charging them with a crime or bringing them to trial as enemy belligerents, and the power to allege that their misconduct qualifies as a war crime, justifying trial by an extraordinary tribunal run by the military. So that threshold is critical for opening the door to these extraordinary powers. And when it's objectively justified, we understand why that's necessary for the state. But what I and most experts believe has happened now is that this is an overzealous or overbroad assertion of armed conflict that is not based on the objective indications and information that is at least publicly available.
All right, so that's an external threat. Let's now turn to what Donald Trump calls the enemy from within. There's a nearly 150-year-old act in America that limits the use of federal troops in law enforcement activities on American soil, with some exceptions, of course. The president is sending the National Guard to some cities, mainly Democratic ones, again claiming a war from within, as he did in the run-up to the last election. The question is this legal?
Well, there's a complicated aspect to this, which is which forces are being deployed. When National Guard forces remain under the command and control of the state governors, what military lawyers call Title 32 status, they're not subject to that law you're referring to, the Posse Comitatus Act, only when they are brought under federal service. And there is statutory authority for the president, or so the president believes and has asserted, to order the National Guard to conduct certain missions without pulling them into federal service. The more controversial use is when he deployed the Marines to the U.S. Marines to Los Angeles, and if he deploys other active duty federal forces to these cities, because then they are subject to that law. But the interpretation of the administration is that that law does not restrict the president's inherent constitutional authority to use those forces to protect vital federal assets like federal buildings. And that's why you're seeing that the scope of these operations is normally allegedly associated with protecting federal buildings and federal law enforcement function as a way to avoid an assertion that there's a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. Of course, that's being litigated, and a federal district judge in California in the Ninth Circuit ruled against the president in favor of Governor Newsom, concluding that that was nothing more than a pretext or an end run around the Posse Comitatus Act, and the use of these forces was unconstitutional.
Professor Corn, what do you think President Trump's endgame is here?
I don't know. I think that there are many Americans, many citizens of this country that are nervous about where this is all headed. I do think that what we have seen from the administration is that the president now feels that the military is a useful tool to do all sorts of things. You know, there's an old saying that when your favorite tool is a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail.
Yeah.
So we have the military in the streets of DC. We have the military in Los Angeles, the threat to deploy them to other cities, Portland, Chicago. We have the Secretary of Defense or War, whichever term you want to use, ordering 600 military legal officers to serve temporary duty as immigration judges, a function that I was certainly never trained for, and I am sure that none of these officers were trained for. We have the military now engaging in armed hostilities against threats that historically and quite rationally have been amenable to law enforcement response authority on the high seas. We've been interdicting drug smugglers with Navy and Coast Guard assets for decades. So I do think that we can derive from this that the president and his administration view the use of the military as politically beneficial because it signals a toughness, if you will, that the president is really taking action against all these threats, even though many of them may be exaggerated or even fabricated. Where that leads us, I don't know, but I do know that the wisdom of the Supreme Court in that case I mentioned, Youngstown, Sheeton 2 versus Sawyer, is that if Congress is AWOL, if Congress is completely compliant and acquiescent in assertions of presidential authority under the claim of emergency, the president is going to run as far as he can with it. And that is a bit frightening.
So when you hear the president say that he wants to use those cities that we mentioned, like Portland, to be, quote, training grounds for troops, what issues do you have with that?
Listen, I honestly think that that aspect of his speech was just President Trump freewheeling,
Gotcha.
Just throwing something out. Using cities for training for American troops, it's illogical.
All right, last question for you, Professor. The president has said before that if the country was engaged in a war during an election, it would be difficult for him to hand over the White House. How do you think all of these moves play into the president's plans for 2028?
Really, that's beyond my scope of expertise. You know, one thing I've always felt is that when experts appear in the media, they should limit their commentary to what they're expert on. That's a political question.
Fair
My
enough.
instinct as a citizen is that he's trolling the opposition a little bit. He's trying to get a rise, maybe distract them from more meritorious things. That's a political issue. And I think obviously it would become a crisis legal issue if there was an effort to suspend an election or to ignore the constitutional amendment that prohibits somebody from running for office. But that really is beyond my scope of expertise.
Well, we appreciate your insights, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I want to say to all our friends in Canada that we respect you and we respect our relationship with you. And we hope that the future continues to build a very strong and positive interstate and personal relations between our two peoples.
Thank you, sir.